The gavel cracked against the oak, shattering the silence. My mother gripped the champagne, convinced her 6-month charade was a victory. They thought I was just the estranged daughter here for scraps, not realizing the woman raising paddle number 1 was their new creditor. When $6,900,000 flashed on the board, my brother's smile died. I did not come for an inheritance. I came to buy back my grandmother's dignity with cash. My name is Eileen Marchant, and for the last 34 years of my existence, I have been treated as a footnote in the glossy, leather-bound biography of my family. I sat in the very last row of the private auction hall at Kingsport Harbor, my back pressed against the cold wainscoting, watching the room fill with people who believed they owned the world. The air here was distinct. It did not smell of the ocean, despite the harbor being fewer than 500 yards away. It smelled of floor wax, old money, and the sharp, metallic tang of calculation. I wore a simple charcoal turtleneck and black trousers, clothes that were clean but blended into the shadows of the room. To the few acquaintances who glanced my way, I was invisible. They looked right through me, their gazes sliding off my silhouette to find someone more important, someone with a net worth that justified a conversation. I was just Eileen, the black sheep, the disappointment who worked with her hands, the woman who smelled of sawdust and varnish rather than Chanel and indifference. They assumed I was here to beg. They assumed I was here to watch the final dismantling of my grandmother's legacy with wet eyes and a trembling lip. They were wrong. The heavy oak doors at the front of the room swung open, admitting a gust of warmer air and the flash of a local photographer's camera. A hush fell over the room, the kind of reverent silence usually reserved for royalty or high court judges. My family had arrived. Richard Marchant, my father, led the procession. He walked with the broad-chested confidence of a man who believes his own lies, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his hand resting possessively on the small of my mother's back. Victoria Marchant glided beside him, her face a mask of practiced sorrow that did not quite reach her eyes. She wore black, of course, but it was a fashionable, structural black, cut to show off the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, and trailing behind them, looking bored and slightly hungover, was my brother, Preston. They moved through the crowd like sharks cutting through a school of fish. People reached out to shake their hands, offering condolences that were as hollow as the walls of this auction house. My father nodded solemnly, accepting the sympathy for a loss he did not feel. My mother dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. It was a performance, a grotesque piece of theater staged for the benefit of the Kingsport Harbor elite. I watched them take their seats in the front row, the prime spots reserved for the principal players. They did not look back. They did not scan the room to see if their daughter had come. To them, I had ceased to exist the day I refused to marry a man whose father could have bailed out Richard's failing investments 15 years ago. My mind drifted back to 3 months ago, to the day Elise Marchant, my grandmother, had finally let go. The hospital room had been cold. Much like this auction hall, I had been the one holding her hand as the monitor flatlined, the high-pitched whine signaling the end of the only person in this family who had ever loved me without condition. My parents had been in the cafeteria, drinking coffee and discussing the probate timeline, when I walked out to tell them she was gone. My mother had not cried. She had checked her watch. She had looked at my father and said, almost audibly, that at least it happened before the fiscal quarter ended. The rage I felt then had been a hot, blinding thing. But over the last 90 days, that rage had cooled. It had hardened into something far more dangerous. It had become a plan. I shifted in my seat, crossing my legs. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like gravel wrapped in velvet, was testing the microphone. The room was nearly full now. I saw the familiar faces of real estate sharks, developers who wanted to tear down history to build glass boxes, and collectors who wanted a trophy. But the prize today was special, the gilded rose. Even the name on the glossy brochure in my lap sent a shiver through me. It was not just a house, it was a Queen Anne-style masterpiece sitting on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. It was where I had learned to walk. It was where I had hidden in the library while my parents screamed at each other about money in the city house. It was a structure of turrets and wraparound porches, of stained glass that turned the morning light into a kaleidoscope of rubies and emeralds. Realistically, in the current market, with its historical significance and prime location, the estate was worth nearly $10 million, but today, it was starting at $2 million. The lowness of the starting bid was the first clue to the corruption rotting the floorboards of this event. My family had done their work well. I saw Preston stand up and scan the room. His eyes, bloodshot and restless, finally landed on me in the back row. A smirk curled his lip. He whispered something to our mother, who did not turn around, and then he began to make his way up the aisle toward me. Preston wore a suit that cost more than my first car, but it hung on him poorly. He had lost weight recently, the gauntness of late nights and bad decisions eating away at his handsome features. He stopped at the end of my row, leaning against a pillar with a casual arrogance that made my fingers itch. "Well, look who decided to crawl out of the woodwork," he said, his voice low enough not to cause a scene but loud enough for the people in the row ahead to hear. "You look out of place. Eileen, the staff entrance is around the back." I looked at him calmly. His pupils were dilated, despite the bright lights of the hall. "Hello? Preston, you look tired." "I am exhausted," he said, letting out a dramatic sigh. "Managing an estate is complex work. Not that you would know anything about that. How is the carpentry business? Still sanding floors for a living?" "I am doing fine," I said simply. He chuckled. A wet, unpleasant sound. "You should not be here. Eileen, this is not a place for spectators, and you certainly cannot afford to raise a paddle. Why do you not go back to your little apartment, or that shabby warehouse you call a studio? Save yourself the embarrassment." "I am just here to pay my respects to Grandma." I lied. I wanted to see who buys her home. Preston leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The smell of stale bourbon was pungent on his breath. "Let me let you in on a little secret. Little sister, nobody's buying this house but us." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? I thought you were broke." He flinched, but quickly recovered his sneer. "That is what you think. See that man down there? The one in the gray pinstripe suit." He pointed to a man sitting near our parents. "Sterling. I knew him. He was the family lawyer. A man who had built a career on finding loopholes in moral decency. He looked like a weasel who had successfully raided a henhouse. Slick and overly satisfied. Sterling fixed it." Preston bragged, unable to help himself. His ego always needed an audience. "We have an arrangement. The valuation was adjusted. The foundation issues. The termite reports. Let us just say the inspection was very thorough in finding faults that scare away the amateurs. We buy it back for pennies on the dollar to settle the estate tax, and then we own it free and clear. It is just a formality. Eileen, a little paperwork shuffle. By dinner time, the Gilded Rose stays with the Marchants, and we unlock the equity. And Grandma's will, I asked, keeping my voice steady. The one that said the house should be preserved. Grandma was senile. Preston spat, the veneer of politeness slipping. "She would have wanted us to be secure. We are doing this for the family. So do yourself a favor. Leave. Watching you sit here in that cheap sweater is depressing." He pushed off the pillar and strutted back toward the front of the room, adjusting his cuffs. He tapped our father on the shoulder as he sat down. And they shared a laugh. They looked so confident. They looked like men who had already spent the money. I looked down at my hands. They were not manicured like my mother's. There were small calluses on my fingertips, the marks of a woman who built things. For 15 years. I had worked. I had started as a laborer, sweeping sawdust in a cabinet shop. I had learned to carve, to draft, to engineer. I had studied architecture at night while working double shifts. Preston called it a shabby warehouse. He did not know that the warehouse was the headquarters of the Atherton Heritage Group. He did not know that the carpenter he sneered at was the founder of the most sought-after historic restoration firm on the East Coast. He did not know that the clients who hired us museums, historical societies, billionaires wanting to save European castles paid millions for our expertise. I had built an empire in the shadows, using a holding company and a board of directors to keep my name off the letterhead. I had done it to protect myself from them. I knew that if they ever found out I had money, they would come for it like leeches. But today, the shadows were lifting. I watched Sterling, the lawyer, whispering to the auctioneer. I saw the nod. The fix was indeed in. They had devalued the house based on fabricated structural damage. They had scared off legitimate buyers with rumors of rot and ruin. They planned to buy a $10 million asset for $3 or $4 million. Financed by a hard money loan they had likely secured using the house itself as collateral before they even owned it. It was fraud, plain and simple. But fraud requires a victim, and they thought the victim was a dead woman who could not speak. I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. It was a message from Sarah, my executive assistant, and the only person outside of my legal team who knew the full scope of what was about to happen. The screen glowed with a single block of text: funds cleared in the trust account. Level 1 liquidity confirmed. Atherton Heritage Group is ready to engage. I looked at the number at the bottom of the bank confirmation attached to the text. $20 million, liquid, ready for immediate wire transfer. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. My heart rate did not spike. My hands did not tremble. A strange, icy calm washed over me. It was the same feeling I got before starting a complex restoration project, the moment when you assess the damage. Pick up the sledgehammer and prepare to strip away the rot to reveal the strong bones underneath. My family thought they were attending a coronation. They thought they were the kings of Kingsport Harbor. They did not realize they were actually defendants in a trial, and the verdict was about to be delivered in 7 figures. The lights in the auditorium dimmed slightly, focusing the beams on the podium. A large screen descended, projecting a photograph of the Gilded Rose. Even in a 2-dimensional image, the house was breathtaking. The wrap-around porch, the intricate gingerbread trim, the widow's walk looking out to sea. It stood proud and resilient, despite the lies being told about its foundation. I looked at the back of my mother's head. She was tilting her glass of champagne, watching the bubbles rise. She looked relaxed. Enjoy the champagne. Mother, I thought, my eyes narrowing, because in about 20 minutes, that vintage Dom Perignon is going to taste like vinegar. The auctioneer cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the high-tech sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We are here today for the estate sale of the property known as the Gilded Rose. I reached into my bag and pulled out my bitter paddle. It was number 001. I had registered weeks ago under a shell corporation. But today, I would raise it as myself. Preston turned around one last time, catching my eye. He rolled his eyes and mimed a shooing motion with his hand. Telling me to get out, I just stared back at him. I did not smile. I did not frown. I just waited. The game was rigged. Yes, but they had forgotten the most important rule of gambling: never bet against the house, especially when the house has a new owner. The auctioneer slammed his gavel down to call the room to order. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. Let the bidding begin. He boomed. I sat back, crossing my arms over my chest. I felt the weight of the $20 million sitting in the digital ether. A sword hanging over their heads. Let it begin indeed. As the auctioneer droned on about the square footage and the historical zoning permits, the present moment began to blur at the edges. The sharp reality of the auction hall faded, replaced by the sepia-toned memories of 15 years ago. To understand why I sat here today with a paddle in my hand and a fortune in the bank, one had to understand the anatomy of the Marchant family. It was a structure built on a foundation of favoritism and roofed with neglect. Preston and I grew up in the same house, but we lived in 2 different worlds. For Preston, life was a series of open doors. When he turned 16, there was a brand new European sports car waiting in the driveway with a red bow the size of a beach ball. When he failed algebra, a private tutor was hired at a rate that could have fed a family of 4 for a month. He attended St. Jude's Academy, where the tuition was higher than the average national salary, and he spent his summers at sailing camps that he inevitably got kicked out of for bad behavior. My parents laughed off his indiscretions. They called them high spirits. They said he was just finding his way. My path was paved with different stones. I attended the local public high school. Not because my parents could not afford 2 tuitions, but because they did not see the return on investment. While Preston was gifted stocks and bonds for his birthdays, I was given practical things: a sewing machine, a set of luggage, items that subtly suggested I should prepare to make myself useful or leave. When I turned 18, there was no car. There was a conversation in my father's study, a room that smelled of cigars and judgment. It was a Tuesday evening. I remembered the day because it was raining, the water hammering against the window pane like 1,000 tiny fists. My father sat behind his mahogany desk, not looking at me, but shuffling through a stack of merger documents. He told me that the family business was facing a liquidity crisis. He told me that he had arranged a dinner with the son of his largest creditor, a man named Julian who was 10 years my senior and had a reputation for cruelty that was whispered about even in our insulated circles. My father did not ask me to date him. He told me I would marry him. He spoke of it as a merger, a strategic alliance that would secure the Marchant legacy. I refused. I did not scream or cry. I simply said no. I told him I was not a piece of collateral to be bartered to cover his bad investments. The silence that followed was louder than the thunder outside. My father finally looked up, his eyes cold and devoid of any paternal warmth. He told me that if I was not willing to contribute to the family, I could not benefit from it. He gave me 1 hour to pack. He said that if I walked out that door, I was on my own. No trust fund, no allowance, no contact. I packed 1 suitcase. I took my clothes, my sketchbooks, and a small wooden box my grandmother had given me. As I walked out the front door, soaking into the rain, I looked back. My mother was standing in the window, watching. She did not wave. She simply closed the drapes. That was the night Eileen Marchant died, and the woman I am today was born. I would have slept on a park bench that night if not for Grandma Elise. She found me 3 blocks away, shivering under a bus stop shelter. She did not take me back to the house. She knew her son, my father, too well. Instead, she drove me to a small motel on the outskirts of town. She pressed a thick envelope of cash into my hand, her bingo winnings and money she had squirreled away from her housekeeping allowance. She held my face in her withered hands and told me something I never forgot. She said that the best revenge is not anger, it is success. She told me to build something they could not take away. She told me to become the master of my own house so that no man could ever evict me again. So I built. I started at the bottom, lower than my family could ever imagine. I took a job as a laborer in a custom cabinetry shop. For 2 years, I swept sawdust, hauled lumber, and sanded wood until my fingerprints were practically erased. My hands, once soft and manicured, became rough and calloused. I learned the language of wood. I learned how oak resists the blade and how pine yields to it. I learned that a structure is only as strong as its joints. While my brother was partying his way through 3 different colleges, I was working days and taking night classes in architecture and structural engineering. I slept 4 hours a night. I ate instant noodles. I wore steel-toed boots instead of heels. But I had a gift. I could see the soul of a building. I could look at a dilapidated Victorian mansion and see the grandeur hiding beneath the peeling paint. I began taking on small restoration jobs on the weekends. I fixed banisters, restored crown molding, and refinished floors. My reputation grew. I was not just a contractor, I was a preservationist. 7 years ago, I founded the Atherton Heritage Group. I chose the name Atherton because it sounded old, established, and distinctly separate from the name Marchant. I wanted my clients to think of old money and stability, not the scandalous decline of my own family. I hired a charming, silver-haired man named Marcus to be the face of the company for meetings. He was my proxy. He shook the hands, drank the scotch, and signed the contracts. I was the ghost in the machine. I was the one doing the designs, managing the investments, and steering the ship. We specialized in buying historic properties that were on the brink of demolition, restoring them to their original glory with modern amenities, and selling them to the ultra-wealthy who wanted a piece of history without the drafty windows. We expanded from Kingsport Harbor to Newport, then to Charleston and Savannah. We became the premier firm for heritage restoration in the country. My parents saw the signs for Atherton Heritage Group on construction sites all over town. They probably admired the work. They never knew that the daughter they disowned was the one signing the paychecks. I kept my distance. I never reached out, but I kept tabs on them. I knew their finances were crumbling. I knew Preston was bleeding them dry. And I knew Grandma Elise was fading. I visited her in secret. I would park my car a mile away and walk through the woods to the servants' entrance of the Gilded Rose. We would sit in the kitchen, drinking tea, and she would tell me about the sharks circling the water. She told me she was worried about what would happen to the house when she was gone. She knew my father wanted to sell it. She knew Preston wanted to cash it out. 1 week ago, the nightmare she feared came to pass. I had a contact in the county clerk's office, an old friend from high school who tipped me off when the probate documents were filed. I requested a copy immediately. When I read the will my parents had submitted to the court, my blood ran cold. It was a forgery, or rather, it was a manipulation of the highest order. The document stated that Elise Marchant left her entire estate to her beloved grandson, Preston Marchant, with the stipulation that the property be liquidated immediately to cover outstanding tax liabilities. It painted a picture of an estate in debt, justifying the auction as a desperate necessity. It was a lie. Grandma Elise paid her taxes religiously. She had no debts, but I knew the truth because I held the truth in a fireproof safe in my office 5 years ago during one of our midnight teas. Grandma had given me a key to a safety deposit box at a bank in the next county. She told me that if anything ever looked wrong, I was to go there. I went to that bank the morning after the funeral. Inside the box was her true last will and testament. In it, she left the Gilded Rose to a charitable trust dedicated to historic preservation. But there was something else. There was a codicil, a supplementary document added just 6 months before she died. The codicil was specific. It stated that if any member of the Marchant family attempted to sell the house for personal profit or contrary to her wishes, a penalty clause would trigger. It was a poison pill designed to ensure that their greed would be their undoing. I could have marched into court with that document. I could have hired a phalanx of lawyers to contest the fake will. I could have dragged my parents and brother through a year-long legal battle that would have exposed their fraud to the world. But legal battles are messy. They are public, and they would have dragged my grandmother's name through the mud. The tabloids would have feasted on the story of the senile old woman and her warring family. My parents would have played the victims, claiming confusion or administrative error. They might have even won a settlement just to make the problem go away. No, a lawsuit was too clean for them. It gave them a chance to negotiate. I looked at the stage where the auctioneer was now describing the crystal chandelier in the foyer. My parents were whispering to each other, likely calculating their cut. They thought they were clever. They thought they had erased the past. I decided then that I would not use the law to stop them. I would use the one language they understood fluently: money. I would let them dig their hole. I would let them leverage everything they had, thinking they were about to strike gold. I would let them believe they had won right up until the second the hammer fell. And then, when they were standing in the wreckage of their own greed, I would reveal the codicil. I would show them that the fortune they thought they were chasing had vanished, diverted by their own actions into a place they could never touch. I adjusted my grip on the bitter paddle. The plastic felt cool and solid. My thumb traced the raised number 001. The time for being the forgotten daughter was over. The time for being the victim was 15 years in the past. Today, I was not Eileen the carpenter. I was not Eileen the outcast. I was the reckoning. The memories faded back into the dark corners of my mind. I focused on the present. The bidding was about to start. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of floor wax and treachery. I was ready. The atmosphere in the auction room shifted from a low hum of anticipation to a sharp, electric tension. While the rest of the attendees studied the glossy brochures or made polite conversation about interest rates, my eyes were locked on a singular figure pacing near the velvet ropes at the side of the room. Preston. He was on his phone, his body angled away from the crowd, but his posture screamed desperation. He had one hand jammed deep into his pocket, rattling his keys, while the other gripped his smartphone so tightly I expected the screen to shatter. He was sweating. I could see the sheen of perspiration on his forehead, even from the back of the room, glistening under the harsh track lighting. He was not making a celebratory call. He was pleading. I did not need to guess who was on the other end of the line. I already knew. 2 weeks ago, I had hired a forensic accountant and a private investigator, a former federal agent named Kavanaugh, who specialized in digging up the kind of dirt people thought they had buried under layers of encryption. The report he had hand-delivered to my office was thick, heavy, and damning. It painted a portrait of my brother not as the successful venture capitalist he pretended to be, but as a man drowning in a sea of his own making. The report detailed a catastrophic spiral that began 18 months ago. Preston had leveraged his personal portfolio to buy into a speculative cryptocurrency exchange that promised returns of 400%. Instead, the exchange had collapsed overnight, taking nearly $2 million of his liquidity with it. But Preston, being Preston, had not cut his losses. He had chased them. He had turned to high-stakes, underground poker games in the city, the kind where the buy-in was $50,000 and the house took a cut of everything. He had lost, and then he had borrowed to play again, convinced his luck would turn. It never did. According to Kavanaugh's intel, Preston currently owed a syndicate of very impatient, very dangerous individuals a sum totaling $4,200,000. The deadline for repayment was tomorrow. That was the terror I saw in his eyes. He was not just worried about losing a house. He was worried about losing his kneecaps. This context illuminated the true nature of my parents' strategy. For the last 6 months, I had wondered why Richard and Victoria Marchant, people who cared about their social standing above all else, would allow Grandma's estate to go to a public auction. It seemed too gauche, too exposed for them. Now, the pieces fit together with sickening precision. They were not wealthy. The Marchant family fortune was a mirage, a facade of leased luxury cars and mortgaged properties. They were asset-rich on paper but cash-poor in reality. They did not have $5 million lying around to bail Preston out. They barely had enough to keep the lights on in their own mansion. So, they had concocted a scheme. It was brutal in its simplicity. They needed to acquire the Gilded Rose, but they could not afford to pay market value for it. If the house sold for its true worth of $10 million, the taxes and fees would eat up a chunk, and the remainder would take months to clear probate. Preston did not have months. He had hours. Their plan was a classic equity skim. First, they had bribed the appraiser I had the bank transfers to prove it to undervalue the property significantly. They had the official starting bid set at a ludicrously low $2 million, with a fraudulent report citing catastrophic structural failure to justify the price. Second, they had secured a bridge loan, a high-interest, short-term loan from a hard money lender, for exactly $4 million. This was their war chest. Their goal was to scare off every other buyer. Purchase the house for $3 million or maybe $3.5 million using the borrowed money, and close the deal instantly. Once the deed was in their name, they would immediately turn around and refinance the property with a legitimate bank. Since they knew the structural damage was a lie, they could get an appraisal for the real value of $10 million. They would cash out $5 or $6 million in equity, pay off the hard money lender, pay off the mobsters threatening Preston, and still have a few million left over to maintain their illusion of grandeur. It was a perfect crime, provided no one else in the room knew the truth. I shifted my gaze from Preston to a man standing near the catering table, sipping a sparkling water. He wore a navy suit that was expensive but understated, the uniform of a serious investor who did not need to flash his wealth. This was Marcus, my attorney and the public face of Atherton Heritage Group. To the room, he was a stranger, perhaps a representative for an overseas conglomerate. To me, he was the sharpest legal mind I knew. We locked eyes for a fraction of a second. He gave a microscopic nod, a signal that everything was in position. He had heard the rumors circulating in the lobby, the poison my father was dripping into the ears of potential bidders. I watched my father, Richard, working the room. He had cornered a pair of developers from New York, men with sharp suits and hungry eyes. I could tell exactly what he was saying by the exaggerated pantomime of his hands. He was pointing at the floor, then making a gesture of something crumbling. He was shaking his head with feigned sadness. I stood up and moved closer, pretending to examine a display case of Grandma's porcelain figurines, just close enough to catch the drift of his conversation. "It is a tragedy." "Really?" Richard was saying. His voice lowered to a confidential baritone. "My mother loved the place, but the maintenance was beyond her. The saltwater intrusion has rotted the pylons. We had an engineer look at it last week. He said the whole east wing is sinking. Frankly, we are just hoping to buy it back to keep it in the family for sentimental reasons, but anyone looking to flip it is going to face $5 million in foundation repairs alone." The developers looked at each other, their enthusiasm visibly dampening. Sinking, one of them asked. The brochure did not mention subsidence. Richard sighed. A masterclass in deception. "Well, the estate laws are tricky about disclosure, but as a gentleman, I would hate to see you boys get stuck with a money pit. The place is practically a teardown, and of course, there are the stories about the hauntings. The staff would not stay past sunset. Bad energy, very bad energy. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. Hauntings, sinking foundations. It was pathetic. If only they knew. 2 years ago, when Grandma Elise first confided in me that she was worried about the house's stability. I had not just offered advice, I had taken action. She had complained about a slope in the library floor and cracks in the plaster. My parents had told her it was just the house settling and ignored it. I knew better. I had brought in my own crew from Atherton Heritage Group. We had worked at night, parking our trucks a mile down the road and hiking in with equipment so the neighbors and my parents would not see. For 3 months, under the cover of darkness, we had reinforced the entire foundation. We had installed steel helical piers, driving them 40 feet down into the bedrock to stabilize the structure. We had replaced the rotted sills with pressure-treated lumber and reinforced the load-bearing beams with carbon fiber. I had spent $200,000 of my own money on materials and labor. Ensuring that the Gilded Rose was solid enough to withstand a hurricane, it was not sinking. It was arguably the most structurally sound building on the entire coastline. My father was lying to these men about a rot that I had personally excised. He was trying to devalue a diamond by claiming it was glass. Unaware that I was the jeweler who had polished it, Preston ended his call and shoved his phone into his pocket. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked over to where our parents were sitting. He looked pale, his skin the color of old parchment. He whispered something to Victoria, and she patted his hand, her face hard and determined. She whispered back, likely reassuring him that the fix was in, that the sinking house story was working, that the other bidders were dropping out. I decided to test the waters. I walked past the row where my family sat, heading toward the water station. As I passed Preston, he shot out a leg, blocking my path. "Still here," he sneered, looking up at me. "I thought security would have escorted you out by now." I stopped and looked down at him. His eyes were darting around the room, unable to hold focus. "I'm just waiting for the show to start." "Preston, you seem anxious. Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," he lied, his voice cracking slightly on the last syllable. "We are about to reclaim our birthright. Unlike you, some of us actually care about this family's legacy." "Legacy," I repeated, testing the word. "Is that what you call it?" "I thought a legacy was something you built, not something you sold to pay off bad debts." Preston froze. For a second, genuine fear flashed across his face. "How did you—" He cut himself off, realizing he was admitting guilt. He narrowed his eyes, leaning forward. "You do not know what you are talking about. You are just a bitter, jealous little girl who thinks she is special because she knows how to use a hammer. Go back to your sawdust. Eileen, this is a game for adults. You do not have the chips to play at this table. He believed it. He genuinely believed that I was destitute, that my simple clothes and lack of ostentatious jewelry meant I was a failure. He had no concept of wealth that did not scream for attention. He did not understand that real power is silent. I leaned in, bringing my face close to his. I smelled the sour mix of fierce sweat and expensive cologne. Be careful, Preston, I said softly. Sometimes the chips are not the only thing you lose. I walked away before he could respond, leaving him staring after me with a mixture of confusion and contempt. I returned to my seat in the back row. Next to the heavy velvet curtains, the room was filling up. The auctioneer had taken his place at the podium, adjusting his glasses. The murmur of the crowd died down. I glanced over at Marcus. He was cool, calm, collecting intelligence. He had signaled that the developers my father had spooked were leaving. 2 fewer competitors. That left only a few legitimate bidders who might still be interested despite the rumors. And of course, the Marchant family. My father looked smug. He adjusted his tie, confident that his disinformation campaign had cleared the field. He thought he was practically stealing the house. I reached into my bag and touched the folder containing the proof of funds. $20 million. It was not just money, it was a weapon. And in a few minutes, I was going to fire it. The auctioneer raised his gavel. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The auction of the estate of Elise Marchant is about to commence. I uncrossed my legs and planted my feet firmly on the floor. I watched the backs of my family's heads. They had no idea that the ghost haunting this house was not a spirit from the past. It was me. The legal proceedings began with the dryness of dust settling in an empty room, but to an ear trained in the nuances of contract law, the air was screaming. Before the first number was even thrown into the air, the auctioneer, a man named Mr. Henderson, who looked as though he had been carved out of mahogany and self-importance, paused. He adjusted his spectacles and looked down at a sheet of paper that had been freshly added to his podium. Standing just to his left, looking like the cat who had not only eaten the canary, but had also successfully foreclosed on the birdcage, was Sterling. Sterling cleared his throat. It was a wet, intrusive sound. There is a procedural addendum to today's auction, Sterling announced. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that could tell you your house was burning down and make it sound like a heating upgrade. Per the stipulations of the estate executors, and in accordance with state property laws regarding heritage assets, we are invoking the family right of first refusal clause. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. I sat perfectly still, my eyes narrowing. This was it. This was the mechanism. Sterling continued, pacing slightly as he spoke, making sure to make eye contact with the few legitimate investors remaining in the room. This clause grants the direct lineal descendants of Elise Marchant, specifically Richard, Victoria, and Preston Marchant, the unilateral right to purchase the property at the closing of the auction. To exercise this right, the family must exceed the highest third-party bid by exactly $1. He paused for effect, smiling benevolently at my parents in the front row. However, he added, his voice dropping a register to sound grave and responsible, in the interest of expedited liquidation to satisfy estate obligations. This right of refusal is capped at a ceiling of $4 million. Should the bidding conclude under this amount, the family retains the priority option to purchase. I watched the room deflate. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, translated from legalese into plain English. The message was clear. Don't bother. If an investor bid $2 million, my father would pay $2,001 and take the house. If they bid $3 million, my father would pay $3,001. The ceiling of $4 million was not a limit on the house's value. It was a psychological fence. They were signaling to the room that they were willing to go up to $4 million to keep the house, and since they had already spread the rumors that the foundation was rotting and the place was worth dirt, no rational investor would dream of bidding anywhere near that amount. Why would a developer bid $3.5 million for a sinking house when they knew the family would just snatch it away for $3.5 million and $1? It rendered the auction futile for anyone but them. It was designed to suppress the price, to keep the bidding low and non-competitive, so they could scoop it up for a bargain. My father leaned back in his chair, draping an arm over the backrest. He looked like a king surveying his secured borders. Preston was smirking, tapping his foot, likely calculating how much of the $5 million loan would be left over for his gambling debts once they bought the house for a suppressed price of maybe $2.5 million. But as I replayed Sterling's words in my head, dissecting the syntax, I saw it. It was a single phrase, third-party bid. The clause specified that the right of first refusal applied to bids made by a third party. It was a standard protection against outside developers. But the language was precise. It did not account for a bid made by another lineal descendant. If the competing bidder was a stranger, the clause worked as a shield. But if the competing bidder was family, if the competing bidder was me, the clause would dissolve. A right of first refusal cannot exist between two people with equal claim. If I bid, the preferential treatment vanished, the cap vanished, the $1 increment vanished. It would become a naked, brutal street fight. A direct auction where the only thing that mattered was who had the deepest pockets. And they did not know I had pockets at all. I kept my face completely blank. I did not smile. I did not scribble on a notepad. I simply sat there, a statue in a charcoal turtleneck, letting them believe their trap was airtight. I glanced across the aisle at Marcus. He was seated 3 rows up, looking every inch the bored, wealthy speculator. He caught my eye, and I gave a nearly imperceptible twitch of my finger. Hold. The plan remained unchanged, but the stakes had just been clarified. Marcus would open the bidding. He would represent Atherton Heritage Group to my family. Atherton was just another nameless, faceless corporation, a third party. They could bully with their claws. They would assume they could just outbid him by $1. They would let him drive the price up a little, playing their game, feeling safe. I would let them feel safe. I would let them walk right up to the edge of the cliff before I pushed. The auctioneer began reading the final terms of sale. My mother, apparently bored with the formalities and confident in their victory, stood up. She smoothed her skirt and turned, scanning the room. Her eyes landed on me in the back row. She sighed, a dramatic heaving of her shoulders, and began to walk up the aisle. The click of her heels on the parquet floor was sharp and rhythmic. People turned to look at her. Victoria Marchant demanded attention simply by existing. She stopped at the end of my row, looming over me. The scent of her perfume, a heavy, floral scent that cost $300 an ounce, wafted over me, choking out the smell of the room. "Eileen," she said, her voice dripping with a poisonous kind of sweetness. I looked up. "Hello, Mother?" She looked me up and down, her lip curling slightly as she took in my plain trousers and sensible boots. She shook her head. "Honestly, darling, I do not know why you insist on doing this to yourself. Coming here, sitting in the back like a servant, it is embarrassing for us. You know, people are whispering. Let them whisper," I said calmly. "I am comfortable." She let out a short, sharp laugh. "Comfortable. You look like you just came from a construction site. Look at your hands." She reached out and hovered her hand over mine, not touching, as if afraid she might catch poverty like a virus. "I did come from a site." I said, "It is called work. You should try it sometime." Her eyes flashed, but she recovered quickly, sliding back into the role of the benevolent matriarch. "Listen to me. We are about to close this deal. It is going to be a celebration. The press is here. We are going to take photos on the steps of the estate." She opened her clutch, a small, glittering thing covered in crystals. She pulled out a checkbook and a gold pen. She scribbled something quickly, tore off the slip of paper, and held it out to me. "Here," she said, thrusting the check toward my face. I looked at it. It was made out to cash. The amount was $500. "Go down to the boutique on Main Street," she said. her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Buy yourself a dress, something that covers all of this. Or better yet, just go home. We will tell people you were feeling unwell. I do not want you in the photos looking like a stray dog we forgot to feed. I stared at the check, $500. It was an insult so precise, so perfectly calculated, that it was almost admirable. $500 was what she spent on a lunch. It was a crumb thrown from the table, meant to silence me, to buy my disappearance. I reached out and took the check. My mother smiled. A triumphant, tight-lipped expression. She thought she had won. She thought everything in the world had a price, and mine was $500. There is a good girl, she said, turning to leave. Wait, I said. She stopped and looked back. What now? I stood up slowly. I was taller than her now. I had grown since the day she kicked me out into the rain. I held the check up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the light catch the ink. You think this buys dignity? I asked softly. I did not wait for an answer. With slow, deliberate movements, I tore the check down the middle. The sound of the paper ripping was quiet, but in the hush of the pre-auction tension, it sounded like a bone snapping. I put the two halves together and tore them again, and again, until the check was nothing but confetti in my palm. My mother's jaw dropped. Her face flushed a deep, blotchy red. You ungrateful little... I reached out and took the flute of champagne she had been holding in her other hand. She was too shocked to resist. I held the glass up, and with a flick of my wrist, I dropped the shredded remains of her $500 into the bubbling golden liquid. The paper immediately began to soak up the alcohol, turning into a soggy, dissolving mess. I handed the glass back to her. You should keep this, I said, my voice ice cold. You are going to need the cab fare for the ride home later. For a moment, I thought she might slap me. Her hand twitched at her side, but the room was watching. The auctioneer was clearing his throat loudly, signaling the start of the proceedings. Richard was turning around in his seat, glaring at us, silently commanding her to sit down and stop making a scene. Victoria Marchant swallowed her rage. She took the glass, her knuckles white around the stem. She looked at me with pure hatred, a look that stripped away any pretense of family. You will regret this, she hissed. When we are done here, you will not even be allowed to drive past the house. We will see, I replied. She spun on her heel and marched back to the front row, setting the glass down on a side table with a force that nearly shattered it. She sat down next to my father, whispering furiously in his ear. He patted her arm, but his eyes were fixed on the podium. I sat back down, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. The adrenaline was there, but it was cold, focused. The auctioneer slammed his gavel down. We are now in session, he boomed. The bidding for the property known as the Gilded Rose, located at 14 Ocean Cliff Drive, will now commence. The starting bid is set at $2 million. Do I have $2 million? The room went silent. My family sat rigid, expecting silence. They expected the fear of the sinking foundation and the weight of their right of first refusal to choke the air out of the room. They expected to lift their paddle once, unopposed, and steal the legacy. I looked at Marcus. He was motionless. We would wait. We would let the silence stretch. We would let them sweat for just a second before the war began. The trap was set. The bait was in the water. And the sharks were about to find out that they were not the only predators in the ocean. $2 million. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. The auctioneer, Mr. Henderson, gripped the sides of his podium with white-knuckled intensity. He looked out over the sea of faces, his eyes scanning the room for the slightest twitch of a hand or the raising of a paddle. The silence that followed his opening call was thick enough to choke on. It was a manufactured silence, a void created by the whispers my father had planted and the lies my brother had spread. I have $2 million as the opening ask. Mr. Henderson boomed, his voice projecting to the back of the hall where I sat. Do I have $2 million for this historic oceanfront estate for 10 heartbeats? Nobody moved. The developers from the city, the ones my father had terrified with stories of sinking foundations and structural rot, kept their hands firmly in their laps. They stared at their shoes or checked their watches, clearly deciding that the risk outweighed the potential reward. The local collectors, people who might have bought the house for sentimental reasons, looked at the Marchant family in the front row and decided it was not worth the social awkwardness of bidding against the grieving relatives. It was exactly what my family wanted: a clean sweep, an uncontested victory. Then, with the slow, deliberate arrogance of a man who believes he has already won the lottery, Preston raised his paddle. $2,100,000. Preston announced. He did not just raise the paddle. He stood up slightly, turning his head so the room could see him. He wanted them to know that the heir was claiming his throne. His voice was loud, cutting through the hush. It was a bid that said, "Go home." It was a bid that said, "This is mine." "Mr.?" Henderson nodded, looking relieved that the proceedings had actually begun. "I have $2,100,000 from Mr. Preston Marchant. Do I have $2,200,000? Silence again. I watched my father, Richard. He did not look at Preston. He looked straight ahead at the stage, his jaw set. I knew what he was thinking. He was thinking about the hard money loan they had secured. They had $4 million in the bank, borrowed at an exorbitant interest rate that would likely bankrupt them if they did not flip the house within 90 days. But right now, at $2,100,000, they were safe. They were well under budget. They were practically stealing the property. My mother, Victoria, let out a breath she had been holding. She reached over and adjusted the lapel of Preston's jacket, a small, proprietary gesture. I looked at Marcus. He was sitting 3 rows ahead of me, his posture relaxed, his paddle resting on his knee. He was waiting for my signal. I did not move my head. I simply tapped the armrest of my chair with my index finger. 1 tap. Marcus lifted his paddle. $2,500,000. Marcus said. His voice was not loud like Preston's. It was calm, bored, almost indifferent. It was the voice of a man buying a sandwich, not a multi-million-dollar estate. The reaction in the room was instantaneous. Heads snapped toward him. People whispered behind their hands. Who was this stranger? Who was this man daring to challenge the Marchant family in their own backyard? Preston whipped around, his eyes wide. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of genuine irritation. He looked at Marcus as if my lawyer were a cockroach that had crawled across a white tablecloth. My father stiffened. I saw his hands clench into fists on his knees. This was not part of the script. The sinking foundation lie was supposed to scare everyone away. Why was this man bidding Mr. Henderson's eyebrows shot up. I have $2,500,000 from the gentleman in the 3rd row. The bid is now $2,500,000. Do I hear $3 million? Preston looked at Richard. Panic was starting to edge into his expression. $2.5 million was still cheap, but every dollar the price went up was a dollar less they had to pay off Preston's gambling debts. Richard turned his head slightly, giving a sharp, imperceptible nod. He was signaling Preston to crush the opposition. He wanted to scare this stranger off with a big jump. He wanted to show strength. Preston turned back to the auctioneer. He raised his paddle again, his movements jerky and aggressive. $3 million, Preston shouted. The room gasped. A $500,000 jump was significant. It was a power move. It was meant to signal that the Marchants had deep pockets and limitless resolve. But I knew the truth. $3 million was the danger zone. They had borrowed $4 million. If they spent $3 million on the house, that left only $1 million for fees, bribes, and the interest payments, and it left almost nothing to pay the $4,200,000 Preston owed to the syndicate. At $3 million, the math started to break. I watched Preston's back. He was breathing heavily. He was terrified. He was praying that this jump would end it. He was praying the stranger would fold. I looked at Marcus. He did not even blink. He did not look at his phone or consult a calculator. He simply waited for the auctioneer to acknowledge Preston's bid. I have $3 million from the family. Mr. Henderson said, the excitement rising in his voice. Do I hear 3,200,000? Marcus raised his paddle. $3,500,000, Marcus said. The air left the room. $3.5 million. My mother let out a small, audible cry. She put a hand to her throat. My father turned fully around in his seat, glaring at Marcus with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. If looks could kill, Marcus would have dropped dead right there on the parquet floor. Preston looked like he was going to be sick. He ran a hand through his hair, destroying his perfect styling. He turned to our family lawyer, Sterling, who was standing near the podium. Preston whispered something frantic. I could read his lips. What do we do? We do not have it. They were out of liquid cash. The hard money loan was capped at $4 million, but they needed closing costs. Bidding $3.5 million pushed them right to the edge of insolvency. Sterling looked at Richard. The lawyer's face was grim. He tapped his briefcase. I knew exactly what that signal meant. I had seen the forensic accounting reports. I knew about the contingency fund. It was money my father had siphoned from the employee pension fund of his failing logistics company. It was illegal money. It was prison time money. It was never meant to be used publicly. But they were desperate. They were cornered. If they lost the house, they lost everything. They lost the ability to refinance. They lost the ability to pay Preston's debts. The mob would come for Preston. The auditors would come for Richard. They had to win, at any cost. Richard gave a single, hard nod to Sterling. Do it. Sterling leaned over and whispered to Preston. Plan B. Use the reserve. Go to the cap. Preston's face transformed. The fear evaporated, replaced by a manic, feverish confidence. He remembered the clause. He remembered the right of first refusal. He remembered that there was a ceiling of $4 million on the family preference clause. He thought that if he bid $4 million, the game was over. He thought that by hitting the cap, he would automatically trigger the clause, forcing the stranger to back down or forcing the auction to close in his favor, because the family preference would lock it in. He stood up again. He turned to look directly at Marcus, a sneer twisting his lips. He wanted to humiliate this stranger. $4 million, Preston screamed. His voice cracked on the number. He slammed his paddle down on the chair in front of him. $4 million. That was it. That was the limit of the loan. That was the entirety of the stolen pension fund. They were all in. They had just pushed every single chip into the center of the table, including chips they had stolen. The room erupted into low murmurs. $4 million for a house that was rumored to be sinking. It was madness. Mr. Henderson, the auctioneer, looked stunned. He adjusted his glasses. I have $4 million from Mr. Preston Marchant. That brings us to the ceiling of the family preference stipulation mentioned earlier. Preston crossed his arms over his chest, grinning wildly. He looked at our parents. My mother was clapping softly, her eyes shining with relief. My father was exhaling a cloud of tension, loosening his tie. They thought they had done it. They thought the stranger was beaten. They believed that because they had hit the $4 million mark, the right of first refusal meant they won by default unless the stranger bid significantly higher, which no rational person would do for a ruined house. Mr. Henderson looked at Marcus. Sir, the bid is with the family at $4 million. Do you wish to advance? Marcus looked at me. It was a subtle glance, barely a flicker of his eyes. I shook my head. Stop. Marcus lowered his paddle. He placed it gently on the empty seat beside him. He leaned back and crossed his legs. The gesture was unmistakable. He was out. Preston let out a whoop of joy. He actually pumped his fist in the air. Yes, he hissed. My mother reached over and hugged my father. They were beaming. They had done it. They had secured the house. They had saved Preston. They had saved themselves. Mr. Henderson raised his gavel, going once at $4 million. He chanted, I watched them celebrate. I saw the relief washing over them, cleansing them of their fear. I saw the arrogance returning, inflating them back to their usual size. They were already mentally moving back into the master suite. They were already spending the equity they would pull out next week. Going twice at $4 million. Mister, Henderson said. I uncrossed my legs. I placed my hands on the armrests of my chair. The leather felt cool under my palms. This was the moment. The trap had snapped shut. They had committed the money. They had exposed their desperation. They had relied on a clause that only worked against strangers. But I was no stranger. Third and final call, mister, Henderson said, his hand raising the gavel high. Sold to wait, I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a razor blade. It was a clear, calm imperative. I stood up. The movement caught the eye of everyone in the room. Heads turned, necks craned. Mister, Henderson froze, the gavel hovering inches above the sounding block. He peered into the dim light at the back of the hall. I beg your pardon, he asked, squinting. My family turned around. Their smiles were still plastered on their faces, frozen in a grotesque tableau of premature victory. They looked confused. They saw me standing there, the poor relation, the carpenter, the girl they had tried to buy off with $500. Preston laughed, a short, nervous bark. Sit down. Eileen, he called out, it is over. You do not have to embarrass yourself further. I ignored him. I ignored the whispers starting to ripple through the crowd. Who is she? Is that the daughter? What is she doing? I stepped out into the aisle. I held my head high. I did not look at the floor. I looked straight at the auctioneer. I said, wait, I repeated, my voice steady and strong. The bidding is not closed. My father stood up, his face reddening. Mr. Henderson, please remove her. This is a private auction for serious investors. My daughter is not herself. She has no business here. Mr. Henderson looked uncertain. He looked from my father to me. Ma'am, unless you are a registered bidder with verified funds, I cannot interrupt the sale. We are at $4 million. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my paddle. I had kept it hidden in my bag until this very second. I held it up. The white plastic caught the light. Number 001. The room went deadly silent. Number 1. The first paddle issued. The paddle reserved for the most qualified, most vetted bidder in the system. I am a registered bidder, I said, walking slowly down the aisle toward the front, and I believe the auction continues until the highest price is met. My mother gasped. Preston's mouth fell open. My father looked as if he had been struck in the chest with a sledgehammer. I stopped 10 feet away from them. I looked at Preston, whose victory was currently draining out of his face like blood from a wound. You bid $4 million. Preston, I asked. He could not speak. He just stared at the paddle in my hand. I turned to the auctioneer. $4,500,000. I said, and then I smiled. The silence that followed my bid was not the empty silence of a void. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a bomb that had just landed in the center of the room, but had not yet detonated. Sterling, the family lawyer, was the first to recover his voice. He did not step forward. He practically lunged toward the podium, his face twisting into a mask of professional outrage. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his other hand gripping the lapel of his expensive jacket, as if he were trying to hold himself together physically. Mr. Henderson. This is highly irregular, Sterling barked, his voice cracking with the strain. I demand that you disregard this outburst. This woman has no standing here. She is a disruption. She is a laborer. He turned to the room, sweeping his arm out in a gesture meant to diminish me. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize on behalf of the family. This is Eileen Marchant, the estranged daughter. She is a carpenter. She sands floors for a living. She does not have the capital to participate in an auction of this magnitude. This is a prank. It is a waste of everyone's time. My father, Richard, found his courage then. He stood up, his face a mottled purple. Get out, Eileen, he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. You have made your point. You have embarrassed us. Now leave before I have security drag you out. You think you can just shout out numbers? You think this is a game. You do not have $10 to your name, let alone $4 million. My mother, Victoria, did not speak. She just stared at me, her eyes darting between my face and the paddle in my hand, trying to reconcile the daughter she had discarded with the woman standing tall in the aisle. I did not look at my parents. I kept my eyes locked on the auctioneer. Mr. Henderson, he looked uncomfortable, caught between the fury of the marchant patriarch and the calm, icy resolve of the woman standing before him. I am waiting. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice cutting through Sterling's bluster. I have placed a bid. Are you going to accept it? Or are you going to let these people dictate how you run your auction house, Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. Ma'am, while I appreciate your enthusiasm, Mr. Sterling raises a valid point regarding financial qualification. This is a high-stakes environment. Unless you are pre-registered with a verified proof of funds, I cannot accept a bid from the floor. I walked forward. I moved with the slow, predatory grace of a panther. I closed the distance between myself and the podium, ignoring the gasps of the onlookers. I stopped right in front of Mr. Henderson. I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with the wax emblem of the Swiss Bank Corporation. I placed the envelope on the podium. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood was soft, but in that room, it sounded like a gunshot. Open it, I said. Mr. Henderson hesitated, then picked up the envelope. He broke the seal. He slid out the single sheet of document paper inside. It was a letter of credit, notarized, stamped, and irrevocable. He adjusted his glasses. He read the document. Then he read it again. His eyes widened behind his lenses. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. He looked up at me. The dismissal was gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound, trembling respect. Is this current? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I replied. Sterling pushed his way to the podium. Let me see that, he demanded, snatching the paper from Henderson's hand. Sterling scanned the document. I watched the blood drain from his face. It happened in stages. First, his forehead went pale, then his cheeks. Finally, his lips turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the number at the bottom of the page. He looked at the bank seal. He looked at the signature of the bank's vice president. It is a forgery, my father shouted from the front row. It has to be. She is a nobody. Sterling slowly lowered the paper. He looked at Richard. He shook his head, a tiny, jerky movement of defeat. It is legitimate, Richard Sterling said, his voice hollow. It is a certified proof of funds. Read the amount I commanded. Sterling looked at me. The arrogance was gone. In its place was fear. Read it, I repeated. Sterling swallowed hard. The verification confirms liquid assets available for immediate withdrawal in the amount of $20 million. The room exploded. $20 million. The number rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. People stood up to get a better look. The developers who had been ready to leave sat back down. The local gossip mongers covered their mouths. My mother slumped back into her chair as if her strings had been cut. 20 million. She looked at my father. Richard, what is happening? My father was frozen. He stared at me, his eyes bulging. 20 million. How you make cabinets. You live in a rental. Where did you steal this money? I laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. I did not steal it. Father, I earned it. Every single cent. I turned to face the room, addressing the audience as much as my family. You all know me as the failure of the Marchant family, I said, my voice projecting clearly without a microphone. You know me as the girl who left. You know me as the carpenter. And you are right. I am a carpenter. I build things. I restore things. I turned to look at Marcus, who was smiling broadly now. You know this man as a bidder for the Atherton Heritage Group. You assumed he was the owner. You assumed he was the power. I walked over to Marcus. He stood up and bowed his head slightly to me. I am not a representative of the Atherton Heritage Group, I said, turning back to my parents. I am the Atherton Heritage Group. I founded it. I own it. I am the CEO, the lead architect, and the sole shareholder. The realization hit my brother. Preston, like a physical blow. He staggered back, gripping the back of his chair. "Atherton," he whispered. "No, that is impossible. Atherton is the biggest restoration firm on the East Coast. They do government contracts, they restore museums, and they restore private offices," I added, locking eyes with my father. "Remember last year?" "Richard," I asked, "remember when you needed your executive suite at the logistics company renovated? Remember the mahogany paneling? Remember the custom library you insisted on? The one that cost you $300,000? My father's face went from purple to white. "You hired Atherton Heritage Group," I continued. "You paid a premium because you wanted the best. You signed the checks. You bragged to your golf buddies about the craftsmanship." I took a step closer to him. "Who do you think carved that mahogany?" "Father." "Who do you think designed the layout? Who do you think cashed your check?" I pointed a thumb at my own chest. "Me. I took your money." "Richard. I took the $300,000 you overpaid for your vanity project, and I put it right into the fund that is about to buy this house out from under you. You funded your own destruction." The room was absolutely silent. The humiliation was total. My father looked like he couldn't breathe. He had been bragging about his office for months, unaware that the daughter he despised had built it, and that the money he paid her was now the sword at his throat. Sterling tried to rally. He was a lawyer. After all, he needed to find an angle. "This is irrelevant," Sterling shouted, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Even if she has the money, the rules of the auction stand. We have invoked the family right of first refusal." He pointed a shaking finger at the auctioneer. "The terms are clear. Henderson. The family has the right to purchase the property if they match the highest bid plus $1, up to a cap of $4 million. Mr. Preston Marchant bid $4 million. That is the cap. The family has exercised its right. The auction is over." Sterling looked at me with a desperate, sweaty triumph. He thought he had found the technicality that would save them. He thought the rules were still on his side. I looked at Sterling. I looked at him with the pity one might feel for a slow child. "You really are a terrible lawyer." "Sterling," I said. I turned to Mr. Henderson. "Mr. Henderson, could you please clarify the wording of the family right of first refusal clause for Mr. Sterling specifically? The definition of the competing party." Mr. Henderson looked at his notes. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at me, then at Sterling. "The clause states," Mr. Henderson read, "that the lineal descendants of Elise Marchant hold a right of first refusal against any third-party bidder." "Exactly." I said. "A third party, an outsider, a stranger." I spread my arms wide. "But I am not a stranger. Am I? I am Eileen Marchant. I am the granddaughter of Elise Marchant. I am a lineal descendant, just as much as Preston is." I stepped closer to Sterling, invading his personal space. "The right of first refusal protects the family from the public. It does not protect the family from itself. When two members of the privileged class bid against each other, the clause cancels out. The cap of $4 million is void because it only applies to outside bids. This is now a direct auction between heirs." I turned to Mr. Henderson. "Is that correct?" "Mr. Henderson." The auctioneer nodded slowly. His face was solemn. "The interpretation is sound. Since Ms. Eileen Marchant is a verified lineal descendant, she is not a third party. The preference clause cannot be exercised against her. The $4 million cap is therefore null and void. The bidding is open and unrestricted." Sterling collapsed. He literally slumped against the podium, his legs giving way. The legal shield he had constructed, the trap he had built to guarantee the family's victory, had just been dismantled. Preston let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. "But we do not have any more money. We are tapped out. We only have $4 million. That sounds like a personal problem." "Preston," I said. I turned my back on them. I walked back to my seat in the back row. I wanted to see the whole room. I wanted to see the backs of their heads as they realized they were drowning. I sat down. I crossed my legs. I picked up my paddle. number 001. The price is at $4 million with Mr. Preston Marchant, I said, my voice calm, steady, and terrifyingly casual. I raised my paddle. I bid $4,500,000. The number hung in the air. $4.5 million. It was $500,000 more than they had. It was $500,000 more than the loan they had taken. It was $500,000 more than the stolen pension money. It was the end of the line. I watched my father turn to my mother. I saw the look in his eyes. It was the look of a man who realizes the car is going over the cliff and the brakes have been cut. Your move. Family, I whispered. The silence that followed my bid of $4,500,000 was not peaceful. It was the silence of a structure groaning under too much weight. The terrifying split second before the support beams snap and the roof caves in. I watched my brother, Preston. The blood had drained from his face so completely that his skin looked like wet ash. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on the paddle in my hand. For the first time in his life, Preston was not looking at a sister he could bully or a problem his parents could bribe away. He was looking at his own executioner. He began to shake. It started in his hands, a fine tremor that rattled the gold watch on his wrist, and then it spread to his shoulders. I knew exactly what he was seeing. He was not seeing a house. He was seeing the faces of the men he owed $4,200,000 to. He was seeing broken kneecaps. He was seeing a shallow grave in the Pine Barrens, without the house to collateralize a loan. He was a dead man walking, and the clock was ticking louder than his heart. My father, Richard, was in a different kind of hell. I could see the gears grinding behind his eyes. He was doing the math of a desperate man. He had stolen from his company's pension fund to scrape together the initial deposit. If he walked away now, he lost that money. It was sunk cost. If he lost the auction, the auditors would come. They would find the hole in the accounts. He would trade his country club membership for a prison cell. He had to win. Winning was the only way to cover the theft. Sterling, the lawyer, looked like he wanted to vomit. He leaned over the railing, whispering frantically to my father, "Mr. Henderson." Sterling stammered, turning to the auctioneer. "The family requests a recess, a brief recess, 5 minutes, to consult on financial logistics. Mr. Henderson looked at me. It was a telling moment. The auctioneer, the arbiter of the room, was no longer looking to the Marchant men for permission. He was deferring to the woman with the $20 million letter of credit. "Ms. Marchant," Henderson asked, "do you have any objection to a brief recess?" I sat back in my chair, smoothing the fabric of my trousers. I looked at my family huddled together like rats on a sinking raft. I could have said no. I could have forced the bid right then and there. They did not have the money. They would have defaulted, and the hammer would have fallen. But that would have been too merciful. I did not just want to beat them. I wanted them to empty themselves. I wanted them to scrape the bottom of the barrel until their fingernails bled. I checked my watch. 5 minutes, I said coolly, but not a second more. My time is billable, and it is expensive. Thank you. Sterling gasped. He grabbed my father by the elbow, and the four of them, Richard, Victoria, Preston, and the lawyer scurried toward the private viewing room at the side of the hall. They moved with a frantic, jerky energy, closing the heavy mahogany door behind them with a thud. The rest of the room exhaled. The murmurs started up again, a buzzing hive of gossip and speculation. People were looking at me, pointing, whispering. I ignored them. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, wireless earbud. I placed it in my right ear and covered it with my hair. I tapped the screen of my phone, activating the app linked to the high-fidelity listening device I had planted in the viewing room 3 days ago. I had hidden it inside the hollow base of a decorative bust of Julius Caesar that sat on the credenza. It was poetic, really. Caesar was betrayed by those closest to him. It seemed like the perfect witness for what was about to happen. The audio feed crackled to life. The sound was crystal clear. "You said she was broke." Preston's voice screamed in my ear. The distortion of his rage made him sound demonic. You said she was living in a slum. Where did she get $20 million? Mother, where? Calm down. Preston. That was my father. His voice shaking. Panicking will not solve this. Calm down. Preston shrieked. I am dead. Dad. Do you understand? If I do not walk out of here with that title deed, I am a dead man. They gave me until Friday. They will kill me. Shut up, Richard roared. You think you are the only one with exposure? I emptied the pension fund. You idiot. If we lose this house, I cannot put it back. I will go to federal prison for 20 years. We are all in the same boat. There was a sound of glass breaking. Someone had thrown something. We have to stop. My mother's voice quavered. She sounded small, terrified. Richard, we cannot beat $20 million. We have to walk away. We have to beg her for mercy. Beg. Preston laughed. A manic, hysterical sound. She hates us. Mom. Did you see her eyes? She wants to bury us. She will not give us a dime. We have to outbid her with what Sterling asked. His voice reasonable but strained. We are at the limit of the hard money loan. We have exhausted the illicit funds. We have nothing left. There is the house, my father said. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous register. My mother gasped. No, Richard, no, not our house. It is the only asset we have left with equity, Richard said, his voice gaining speed as he convinced himself. The estate on Highland Avenue. It is unencumbered. We own it outright. It is worth $4 million conservative estimate. That is my home. Victoria cried. That is where I live. You cannot gamble our roof. It is temporary, Victoria. Richard snapped. Listen to me. We use the house as collateral for an emergency bridge loan. Sterling can arrange it on the spot with his private lenders. We get another $4 million. That gives us a war chest of $8 million total. We buy the Gilded Rose. We refinance next week, based on the real value of $10 million. We pay off the loan on our house. We put the money back in the pension fund, and we pay off Preston's thugs. We lose nothing. And if we lose, Sterling asked softly, if she keeps bidding, she won't. Preston insisted. She is bluffing. She has a letter of credit. Sure, but she is a businesswoman. She is not going to overpay. The house is worth $10 million max. If we push it to 6 or 7, she will walk away because the profit margin is gone. She is logical. We just have to be irrational. We have to show her we are crazy enough to burn it all down. I sat in the auction hall, listening to them rationalize their own destruction. It was fascinating. They were convincing themselves that I was operating on a profit motive. They thought I was looking for a return on investment. They did not understand that I was not looking for profit. I was looking for a funeral. Do it, Richard said. Sterling, make the call. Get the lien on the Highland Avenue house. Get us the liquidity. Now. But Richard, my mother sobbed. Do it, Richard screamed. Or do you want to visit your son in the morgue and your husband in a cell? There was silence, followed by the sound of Sterling murmuring into his phone. I took the earbud out and placed it back in my purse. They were going to bet their own home, the house I grew up in, the house where I was told I was worthless. They were throwing it into the pot. The mahogany door opened. They walked out. They looked different now. The panic was still there, buzzing underneath their skin, but it had been plastered over with a brittle, terrifying resolve. Preston's eyes were bloodshot and wide. Richard walked with the stiff gait of a soldier marching into machine gun fire. Victoria looked pale, clutching her purse as if it contained her last breath. They took their seats. They did not look at me. Mister? Henderson looked at the clock. The recess is over. The bid stands at $4,500,000 with Mrs. Eileen Marchant. Do I have a counterbid from the family? Preston stood up. He did not use the paddle. He just shouted, $5 million. The room gasped again. $5 million. They had just found another $500,000 in 5 minutes. I did not wait for the auctioneer to repeat it. I did not look at Marcus. I did not look at my notes. $5,500,000. I said, my voice was bored. I said it as if I were ordering coffee. Preston whipped his head around. He looked like he had been slapped. He had expected me to hesitate. He had expected me to calculate. He looked at Richard. Richard nodded, sweat dripping down his temple. $5,700,000, Preston shouted. $6 million, I countered instantly. The speed of my response was the weapon. I was denying them the time to think. I was denying them the time to realize they were drowning. I was forcing them to react on pure adrenaline and fear. 6 million. We were now well past the point of rationality. The house, in its current damaged state according to their own lies, was not worth this. They were bidding on a ghost. Preston was vibrating. He grabbed the back of the chair in front of him so hard his knuckles turned white. 6,200,000, he screamed. 6,500,000, I replied. My mother let out a whimper. Preston looked at Sterling. Sterling was shaking his head, signaling that they were reaching the absolute limit of what they could scrape together even with their own house as collateral. Preston's face twisted. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated madness. He was not bidding for a house anymore. He was bidding for his life. He needed to scare me. He needed to name a number that was so high, so insane, that I would have to fold. $7 million, Preston roared. Wait, no, he stopped himself. He didn't have 7. The loan on their house wouldn't stretch that far. He faltered. 6 million. He looked at Richard. Richard held up 6 fingers, his hand trembling. That was it. That was the ceiling. That was every penny they owned. Stole and borrowed. $6 million. Mr. Henderson asked, confused. We are already at 6.5 with Miss Marchant. No, Preston yelled. I mean, he looked at me. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the exit. 7 million is too much, he babbled. I bid 6,800,000. He spat the number out like a curse. $6,800,000. It was everything. It was the absolute maximum. If I went $1 higher, they were finished. I sat there. I did not speak immediately. I let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. I looked down at my hands. I frowned slightly, as if I were reconsidering, as if I were doing mental math and not liking the result. Hope is a cruel thing. I saw it bloom on their faces. Preston stopped shaking. His shoulders dropped. He thought he had done it. He thought he had found my breaking point. He thought I was calculating the ROI and deciding it wasn't worth it. Richard wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, a trembling smile touching his lips. They thought they had survived. They thought they had pushed the businesswoman too far. My mother, Victoria, saw my hesitation and mistook it for weakness. The fear in her eyes was replaced instantly by the old, familiar malice. She could not help herself. It was in her nature to kick a dog when it was down. She stood up slowly, smoothing her skirt. She turned to me, her face twisting into a sneer of triumph. "What is the matter?" "Eileen," she called out, her voice shrill in the quiet room. I looked up at her. "Run out of play money," she taunted. "Did you finally realize you are out of your depth?" She laughed. A harsh, jagged sound. "Go home," she spat. "Go back to your sawdust and your little work boots. Go back to the pig trough where you belong. You were never one of us, and you never will be." The insult hung in the air, gross and unnecessary. The room recoiled. Even the hardened investors looked shocked by the venom in her voice. But I did not recoil. I felt a strange sense of peace. She had just given me the permission I did not need, but appreciated nonetheless. She had reminded me exactly who she was. She had reminded me why I was doing this. I looked at the auctioneer. I looked at the digital board displaying the number 6,800,000. I looked at Preston, who was grinning now, thinking he had won. I stood up. I did not look angry. I looked like a teacher who was about to correct a very stupid student. I looked at my mother, a pig trough. I repeated softly. I turned to Mr. Henderson. I raised my paddle. $6,900,000. I said. The smile slid off Preston's face like sludge. My mother's mouth snapped shut. My father gripped his chest. I did not sit down. I remained standing, looking down at them. I am not going anywhere. Mother, I said, but you might want to start packing. The number hung in the air, vibrating with a specific, resonant frequency that seemed to crack the very foundation of my family's resolve. $6,900,000. To the rest of the room, it was an arbitrary escalation, a weirdly specific figure thrown out to break the round number psychological barrier. To the auctioneer, it was just another increment in a commission check. But to me, and unknowingly to the three people crumbling in the front row, it was a tombstone. I remained standing, my hand resting lightly on the back of the chair in front of me. I did not look at the auctioneer. I looked at the platinum watch on my left wrist. The second hand swept past the 12, marking the passage of time that my family no longer had. 69. That was the number. It was not a calculation of equity or market cap analysis. It was a memory. I was 12 years old. My grandmother, Elise, was 69. It was the year my parents had forgotten my birthday because they were hosting a gala for the governor. I had spent the day in my room, staring at the wall, feeling that familiar, crushing invisibility. Late that night, Grandma Elise had snuck into my room. She smelled of lavender and sawdust from the little workshop she kept in the carriage house, the workshop where she first taught me how to hold a chisel. She had handed me a small, roughly carved wooden horse. It was not perfect. One leg was slightly shorter than the others, and the sanding was uneven. But she had made it. She had spent hours in the cold carriage house, carving it out of a block of cedar. Just for me. She told me that it was a Mustang, a wild thing that could never be tamed, just like me. The next morning, my mother found it on my dresser. She picked it up with 2 fingers, sneered at the primitive quality of it, and tossed it into the trash compactor in the kitchen. She told me that merchants did not play with garbage. She told me she would buy me a porcelain doll instead. I never got the porcelain doll, and I never saw the wooden horse again. But I remembered the look on my grandmother's face when she found out. She was 69 years old, and she had cried because her gift of love had been discarded as trash. Now, 22 years later, I was assigning a value of $100,000 to every year of her life when she gave me that horse. I was valuing the garbage at nearly $7 million. The silence in the room stretched thin, taut as a piano wire. Mr. Henderson, the auctioneer, finally blinked. He looked at the bid sheet, then at me, then at the stunned faces of the Marchant family. The bid is $6,900,000. With Ms. Eileen Marchant, he announced. His voice lacked its earlier boom. It was hushed, respectful of the sheer violence of the sum. He turned to my father. Mr. Marchant, do you wish to counter? Richard Marchant looked like a man who had been pulled from a shipwreck only to realize he was stranded on a desert island without water. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He turned to Sterling. The lawyer was frantically tapping on his smartphone, his thumb a blur of motion. He was trying to bypass the standard approval channels. He was trying to call the private banking division of the firm that held the mortgage on my parents' current home, the home they had just verbally agreed to leverage. Sterling's face was slick with sweat. He held the phone to his ear, his knuckles white. "Pick up," he hissed, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "Pick up, you son of a—" I watched Marcus. He was sitting perfectly still, studying his fingernails. He knew exactly who Sterling was calling. He also knew that at 8:30 this morning, a courier from Atherton Heritage Group had delivered a sealed packet to that very bank. Inside the packet were the forensic accounting reports detailing my father's embezzlement of the pension fund and Preston's massive, unsecured gambling debts. Banks are risk-averse institutions. They do not lend millions of dollars to men who are actively committing grand larceny. Sterling's eyes went wide. The call had connected. "Vance, listen to me," Sterling whispered urgently, hunched over his phone. "We need an immediate override on the equity line. Yes, the Highland Avenue property. We need to push the limit to $8 million. Yes, right now. I know it is irregular." But Sterling stopped. He went completely still. He listened for 5 seconds, then 10. His face turned a color I had never seen on a human being before, a sort of translucent, sickly green. "But that is impossible," Sterling stammered. "The valuation is solid." "What do you mean, risk assessment? What new information?" Vance? "Do not do this. We are in the middle of the—" He pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at the screen. The line was dead. Sterling slowly lowered his hand. The phone slipped from his grip and clattered onto the floor. He did not move to pick it up. Richard grabbed Sterling by the lapels of his jacket, shaking him. "What did he say?" Richard demanded, his voice a hoarse croak. "What did he say?" Sterling. Sterling looked at my father with dead eyes. "They denied the increase." He whispered. "They froze the line. Richard, they said they received a compliance alert this morning regarding the pension fund. They are freezing all your accounts pending an investigation." The words floated through the quiet room. Compliance alert, pension fund, investigation. It was the final nail. Not only could they not bid, but they were also financially paralyzed. The credit they thought they had was gone. The leverage was gone. My father released Sterling and staggered back. He looked at his hands, as if wondering how they had lost their grip on the world so quickly. Preston let out a low moan. He looked at the exit, then at me, then at the floor. He realized that the $6,800,000 bid he had made moments ago was a check his body could not cash. He had pushed the price up, and now he was left holding nothing but debt and a death sentence. I looked at Mr. Henderson. "I believe the family is finished," I said. "Mr." Henderson looked at the huddled group. He waited. He gave them a professional courtesy that they did not deserve. He waited for a miracle that was not coming. "Do I have a counterbid of $7 million?" Henderson asked softly. Richard sank into his chair. He put his head in his hands. Preston stared at the wall, catatonic. Victoria Marchant sat frozen, her posture rigid, her eyes locked on me. She was not crying. She was not panicking. She was looking at me with a dawning, horrific realization. She was realizing that this was not a business transaction. She was realizing that I had not come for the house. I had come for them. "Going once at $6,900,000, Henderson intoned. The words were a drumbeat. I stood there, feeling the weight of the victory. It did not feel like joy. It felt like gravity. It felt like the settling of a massive stone that had been suspended in the air for 15 years. "Going twice," Henderson said. I looked at the house on the screen behind him. The gilded rose. It looked beautiful. It looked safe. It looked like it was finally ready to breathe again. "Fair warning," Henderson said, raising the gavel. I took a deep breath. I smelled the floor wax. I smelled the old money. I smelled the fresh, clean scent of total devastation. Sold. The gavel came down, crack, to Ms. Eileen Marchant for $6,900,000. The sound of the wood striking wood was the sweetest thing I had ever heard. It was louder than my father's shouting. It was louder than my mother's insults. It was louder than the rain that had fallen on me the night I left home. The room erupted into applause. It was polite. Confused applause from the spectators who didn't understand the blood sport they had just witnessed. But applause nonetheless. But in the front row, there was no applause. Preston collapsed. His legs simply gave out, and he slid from his chair onto the floor in a heap of expensive fabric and wasted potential. He curled into a ball, his hands over his head, hiding from a world that was about to come collecting. Richard gasped, clutching his chest. His face was gray. Sterling yelled for water, for a medic, for help. The stress of the moment, the shock of the frozen accounts, the crushing reality of the audit, it was hitting him all at once physically. And then there was my mother. Victoria Marchant did not look at her husband. She did not look at her son on the floor. She looked only at me. Her eyes were wide, rimmed with red, and filled with a terror so profound it looked like madness. She looked at me as if I were something unholy. She looked at me as if I had peeled off a human mask to reveal a monster underneath. She mouthed one word, I saw her lips move. Monster. I looked back at her. I did not blink. I did not smile. I simply nodded. If being a monster was what it took to protect the things I loved from people like them, then I would wear the horns with pride. I walked toward the podium to sign the papers. I walked past them. I walked past Preston shivering on the floor. I walked past my father gasping for air. I walked past my mother's hate. I did not stop. I did not look down. I had a house to claim. The echo of the gavel was still bouncing off the high vaulted ceiling when the double doors at the back of the room burst open. This time, it was not a grand entrance by a socialite or a dramatic exit by a defeated bidder. It was the precise, synchronized arrival of consequence. 6 men and women in dark, ill-fitting government suits marched into the room. They did not look at the art on the walls or the crystal chandeliers. They looked at the people in the front row. The leader, a woman with a badge clipped to her belt that caught the light, moved with the terrifying efficiency of a person who had already filled out the paperwork and just needed a body to match the file number. The room went from stunned silence to a low, panicked vibration. The investors and spectators, realizing that this was no longer a social event but a crime scene, began to shuffle backward, creating a wide perimeter around the Marchant family. My father, Richard, was still gasping for air in his chair, his face a mask of gray sweat. When he saw the agents, the gray turned to a ghostly white. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to cooperate. Sterling, the lawyer, stopped trying to help him. He took 2 steps away from his client, a reflex of self-preservation that was as instinctive as it was useless. I walked up the steps to the podium. Mr. Henderson, the auctioneer, looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. He stepped aside without a word, surrendering the microphone as if it were a loaded weapon. I tapped the microphone twice. The sound thumped through the speakers, commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice calm and amplified, filling every corner of the hall. "Please remain seated. The authorities are here to ensure the integrity of the proceedings and to collect evidence regarding the fraudulent financial activities of the Marchant estate." My mother, Victoria, snapped her head toward me. Her eyes were wild. "Fraudulent," she shrieked, finding her voice in the midst of the collapse. "You are the fraud. You just bought a house with money you do not have. You are the one who should be arrested." I looked down at her. She was still clinging to the delusion that she could shout her way out of reality. "Actually, Mother, I have the money," I said, "as Mr. Henderson has verified. The funds are liquid and ready for transfer, but there is a small detail about that transfer that you seem to have overlooked, or rather, a detail you intentionally tried to bury." I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a document. It was old, the edges slightly yellowed, enclosed in a protective plastic sleeve. Sterling saw it. He squinted, and then his eyes widened in recognition. It was the document he had legally advised my parents to ignore, the document they had shredded a copy of, thinking the original was lost to the fire of a fireplace. They did not know I had the original. "This," I announced, holding the paper up, "is the codicil to the last will and testament of Elise Marchant. It was executed 6 months before her death, witnessed by her personal physician and notarized by a clerk who, unlike Mr. Sterling, could not be bought." I looked at Preston, who was still curled on the floor, staring up at me with the dull eyes of a trapped animal. "You all thought the game was simple." I continued. "You thought that by forcing the estate into auction, you could liquidate the asset, pay off your debts, and pocket the difference. You thought that even if you lost the house, you would at least get the money from the sale. After all, Preston is the named beneficiary in the primary will." I paused, letting the logic sink in. "That is how it usually works. The house sells for $6,900,000. The estate debts are paid. The remainder goes to the heir. That is what you were counting on. That is why you were willing to bet everything. Even if I bought it, you thought you would get my money." My father looked up. Hope, a desperate and ugly thing, flickered in his eyes. He was doing the math. If I paid $6.9 million, that was enough to solve their problems. They would lose the house, yes, but they would have the cash. They could pay off the mob. They could pay back the pension fund. I smiled. It was not a nice smile. However, I said, slicing through his hope, Grandmother Elise knew you. She knew you better than you know yourselves. She knew that Preston was a gambler. She knew that Richard was a thief. And she knew that Victoria cared more about appearances than legacy. I began to read from the document. Clause 4, Section B. In the event that the property known as the Gilded Rose is not retained by the family for preservation, but is instead offered for public sale, auction, or liquidation by the compulsion of my heirs. I looked up. That means you. I clarified. You forced this auction. You claimed insolvency to justify selling it. You pulled the trigger. I went back to the text. Then the entirety of the proceeds from said sale, after the settlement of municipal taxes, shall bypass the named beneficiaries completely. The room was deadly silent. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The net proceeds shall be donated, in their entirety, to the Kingsport Harbor Feral Cat Sanctuary and Rehabilitation Fund, to ensure the care and feeding of the strays that my family so frequently kicked off our porch. I lowered the paper, the Feral Cat Sanctuary. I repeated clearly. A ripple of nervous laughter went through the back of the room. It was absurd. It was hilarious. It was perfect. My mother stood up. Her legs were shaking so hard I could see the fabric of her skirt vibrating. No, she whispered. That is not legal. That is insane. She hated those cats. She loved those cats. I corrected. She fed them every night. You were the one who called animal control to have them exterminated. She never forgave you for that. And now, she is making you pay for their kibble. $6,900,000 worth of kibble. I turned to the auctioneer. Mr. Henderson, as the purchaser, I am instructing my bank to wire the funds directly to the trust account specified in this codicil. The routing number is attached. I looked back at my family. This means, I said, speaking slowly so they would not miss a single syllable, that the $6,900,000 I just bid does not go to you, not a cent of it. It goes to the cats. The impact of the words hit them like a physical wave. Preston let out a scream that sounded like a piece of metal tearing. He understood. He understood that the $4,200,000 he owed to the syndicate was still owed. And now, he had zero means to pay it. The sale of the house had generated zero liquidity for him. Richard slumped sideways, caught by Sterling before he hit the floor. He understood too. He had emptied the pension fund. He had leveraged his own home. He had spent nearly $4 million of money he did not have to rig an auction that resulted in a donation to a cat shelter. Let us review the balance sheet. Shall we, I said, twisting the knife. You borrowed $4 million from a hard money lender to secure the deposit and pay the bribes. That money is spent. You cannot get it back. You owe that debt immediately. You embezzled approximately $2 million from your company's pension fund. That money is gone. And since the sale proceeds are going to charity, you cannot replenish the fund. The auditors are freezing your assets as we speak. You just leveraged your primary residence on Highland Avenue for an emergency line of credit to drive the bid up. You owe that money too. And Preston, I looked at my brother, you still owe your friends in the city $4 million, and you have no house to give them. I paused. You are not just broke. You are catastrophically, irrevocably insolvent. You have lost the Gilded Rose. You are about to lose your own home. You are facing federal prison charges for embezzlement. And you have effectively paid $4 million of your own borrowed money to facilitate a transaction that benefits a charity for stray animals. I leaned over the podium, looking down at them. It is the most expensive donation in history. Father, you should be proud. You are finally a philanthropist. Sterling, the lawyer, dropped his briefcase. He looked at the agents approaching him. He knew that as the legal architect of the scheme, he was just as liable. He raised his hands in surrender before they even asked. My mother looked around the room, searching for a sympathetic face. She found none. The socialites she had groomed, the people she had tried to impress. were looking at her with a mixture of horror and amusement. She was no longer the queen of Kingsport Harbor. She was a punchline. "You tricked us," she hissed, tears of rage streaming down her face. You knew about the codicil. You let us bid. You let us spend everything I did not make you bid." "Mother," I said coldly, "I did not make you steal from a pension fund. I did not make Preston gamble. I simply gave you the rope. You were the ones who tied the noose. You were the ones who kicked the chair." I stepped down from the podium. The agents moved in. They separated the family. One agent took Sterling by the arm. Another helped my father up, reading him his rights in a monotone voice. Preston was hauled to his feet, weeping openly, begging for a phone call that no one would answer. I walked up to my mother. She was standing alone, trembling. The police were waiting for her too, likely for conspiracy to commit fraud. She looked at me. Her eyes were full of hate, but under the hate, there was a terrible, crushing fear. "What happens to us?" she whispered. I looked at her. I thought about the 15 years of silence. I thought about the rain. I thought about the $500 check she had tried to buy me off with. "I do not know," I said honestly. "But I hear the Feral Cat Sanctuary is looking for volunteers to scoop litter. It might look good on your parole application." I turned my back on her. I walked toward the exit doors at the side of the stage, the ones that led to the private office where the transfer papers were waiting. Behind me, I heard the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. It was a sharp, metallic sound. It sounded like justice. The gavel had fallen. But the true noise of the aftermath was just beginning. It was a cacophony of justice, disjointed and terrified, echoing off the high walls of the auction house. While the uniformed officers were busy securing my father and advising Sterling of his rights, a different kind of authority was asserting itself near the rear exit. I watched from the podium, my vantage point offering a clear view of the shadows where the legal system did not reach. Preston had tried to crawl toward the side door, hoping to slip away in the confusion. He did not make it. Two men, who had been standing quietly in the back row for the entire auction, stepped into his path. They did not wear the badges of federal agents. They wore ill-fitting leather jackets and expressions of bored violence. These were the collectors for the syndicate, the men holding the note on Preston's $4 million gambling debt. One of them reached down and grabbed Preston by the collar of his Italian suit. He hoisted my brother to his feet with the casual effort of a man picking up a dropped napkin. Preston began to scream, thrashing against the grip. But the second man stepped in close, pressing something hard and unseen into Preston's ribs. The scream died in his throat, replaced by a whimper of pure terror. There were no Miranda rights read in that corner of the room. There was no promise of a lawyer or a phone call. The men simply marched him out the emergency exit, his expensive shoes dragging uselessly across the floor. The metal door clicked shut behind them, sealing Preston into a future he had purchased with his own greed. He would not be seen in Kingsport Harbor for a very long time, and if he ever returned, he would not be whole, at the front of the room. The scene was more bureaucratic, but no less devastating. Richard Marchant, the man who had terrified me with a single glance for 18 years, looked small. The federal agents had pulled his hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was audible over the low murmur of the crowd. He was weeping, not with remorse, but with the pathetic realization that his image was shattered. He was trying to explain to the agent that it was all a misunderstanding, that the pension fund was just a temporary loan, but the agent was not listening. He was reading a list of statutes that carried mandatory prison sentences. I walked down the steps of the podium. The crowd parted for me. I did not look left or right. I walked toward the main entrance, the heavy glass doors that led out to the harbor and the open air. I pushed through the doors and stepped out onto the wide stone portico. The ocean air hit me like a physical blessing. It was cold, sharp, and smelled of salt and freedom. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes, but it felt clean. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with oxygen that did not taste of floor wax and betrayal. Eileen, the voice was shrill, desperate, and scraped against the peaceful sound of the waves. I did not stop walking. but I slowed my pace. Eileen, please wait. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs. I turned around slowly. My mother, Victoria, was stumbling down the steps after me. She had somehow evaded the initial sweep of arrests, likely because her name was not on the corporate documents my father had forged. She looked like a ruin. Her mascara was running in black streaks down her cheeks. Her hair, usually sprayed into a helmet of perfection, was wild and disheveled. She had lost a shoe somewhere in the lobby and was limping on one heel and one stockinged foot. She caught up to me, grabbing my arm. Her grip was weak, trembling. Eileen, you cannot just leave us here, she sobbed. They took your father. They took Preston. I do not know where they went. I am all alone. I looked at her hand on my sleeve. I did not shake it off. I simply looked at it until she felt the coldness of my gaze and pulled back. You are not alone. Mother, I said, you have your memories. You have your reputation. Isn't that what you always valued most? She shook her head frantically. No. Listen to me. We are family. Blood is thicker than water. You won. You beat us. Okay, you proved your point. You are the smart one. You are the successful one. I admit it. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, a gesture so unrefined it would have horrified the woman she was 2 hours ago. But you have the house now, she pleaded. The Gilded Rose. It is massive. It has 12 bedrooms. Eileen, 12, and I have nowhere to go. The bank is seizing the Highland Avenue house tomorrow. They are putting a padlock on the door. I will be on the street. She looked up at me, eyes wide and imploring, trying to summon the ghost of maternal authority. Just give me one room, she begged. That is all I ask. One small room in the servants' quarters. I will stay out of your way. I can cook. I can help you manage the estate. Please, Eileen, you cannot let your own mother sleep under a bridge. We are family. The wind howled around us, tearing at the hem of her ruined dress. I looked at the woman who had thrown away my wooden horse. I looked at the woman who had watched me pack my bags 15 years ago and close the drapes. I looked at the woman who had tried to buy my dignity for $500 less than an hour ago. I looked toward the cliff where the Gilded Rose stood, its silhouette proud against the gray sky. You are right, Mother, I said softly. The house is very large. It has 12 bedrooms. Her face lit up with a pathetic, eager hope. Yes, exactly. You would not even notice I was there. But, I continued, my voice hardening like concrete setting in the sun. Every single one of those rooms is filled. Filled, she asked, confused. But you live alone. Who is filling them? They are filled with the memory of Elise Marchant. I said, they are filled with the spirit of the woman you betrayed. They are filled with the dignity of the grandmother whose legacy you tried to sell for gambling money. And frankly, Mother, there is simply no room left for the people who broke her heart. The hope vanished from her face, replaced by the hollow realization that she was truly, finally cut off. But I have nowhere to go, she whispered. I have no money. I have no friends. They will all turn their backs on me now. I reached into the pocket of my trousers. I pulled out a small, stiff card. It was white with blue lettering. I handed it to her. She took it, her hands shaking. She squinted at the text. The Kingsport Community Outreach Center. She read, It is a shelter. I explained. It provides hot meals, warm beds, and job placement services for the indigent. It is clean. It is safe. And best of all, it is free. She looked up at me, horror dawning on her face. You want me to want Victoria Marchant to go to a homeless shelter? I smiled. It was a genuine smile this time. It is not just a shelter. Mother, it is the shelter that I just fully funded. The $6,900,000 I paid for the house. That is where it went. I just became their largest donor. I am sure if you tell them who you are, they will give you an extra blanket. I leaned in close. So close I could smell the stale champagne on her breath. Consider it my final gift to you. I bought you a place to stay. I just didn't buy you a mansion." I straightened up and turned away. "Eileen," she screamed after me. "You cannot do this. I am your mother." I kept walking. The wind carried her voice away, turning her screams into nothing more than the cry of a seagull, distant and irrelevant. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb as I reached the street. It was not a taxi, it was a customized Maybach, the mobile office of the Atherton Heritage Group. The back door opened before I even reached it. I slid into the leather interior. The silence inside was instant and luxurious. The chaos of the auction, the wind, the screaming mother, it all disappeared behind the double-paned acoustic glass. Sitting across from me were two of my senior architects, David and Sarah. They had a large roll of blueprints spread out on the fold-down table between us. They looked up as I entered, their faces serious and ready. "Is it done?" Sarah asked. "It is done," I said. David nodded. He tapped the blueprints. "We have the preliminary sketches ready for the conversion. The zoning board has already given us a tentative approval based on the preservation status." I looked down at the drawings. They were beautiful. They showed the Gilded Rose not as a private residence, but as a public space. "We are going to restore the exterior to the exact specifications of the 1890 original construction," I said, tracing the line of the wrap-around porch with my finger, "but the interior is where we make the statement. The first floor will be a museum dedicated to the maritime history of Kingsport and the legacy of Elise Marchant." I instructed, "I want her workshop recreated exactly as it was. I want the wooden horses on display. I want the world to see what she created." "And the upper floors?" David asked. "The upper floors will be the new global headquarters of the Atherton Heritage Group." I said, "My office will be in the tower room, the one looking out over the ocean." Sarah smiled. "The room your father always wanted for his study." "Exactly," I said. The driver pulled the car away from the curb. I did not look back at the auction house. I did not look for my mother on the sidewalk. That part of my life was a book I had finished reading and thrown into the fire. Sarah handed me a thick leather folder, the transfer deeds, the ownership papers, the title. "Everything is here. It just needs your signature to make it official. The wire transfer has already cleared to the charity." I took the gold fountain pen she offered. The weight of it felt good in my hand. It felt like a tool. It felt like a weapon. I opened the folder. The paper was crisp and white. "Owner Eileen Marchant." I looked at the name. For years, I had hidden behind shell companies and proxies. I had hidden behind the shame my family had piled onto me. I had hidden behind the idea that I was not enough. But today, the hiding ended. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. The ink flowed black and permanent. I signed my name with a flourish, a signature that took up space, a signature that demanded to be seen. There was no forgiveness in the stroke of the pen. I did not forgive my father for his cruelty. I did not forgive my mother for her vanity. I did not forgive Preston for his greed. Forgiveness is for mistakes. What they did was a choice, and this was my choice. I was not doing this out of spite. I was doing it out of justice. I was balancing the scales that had been tipped against me for 34 years. I had bought back my history. I had bought back my name. And I had bought back the only home that had ever mattered. I capped the pen and handed the folder back to Sarah. "Let's go home," I said. The car accelerated smoothly, merging onto the highway that led toward the cliffs. The ocean sparkled in the distance, vast and indifferent and beautiful. I watched the world pass by through the tinted window. I was 34 years old. I was the owner of a $6,900,000 estate. I was the CEO of an empire. And for the first time in my life, I was free. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I would love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Blue Payback channel, like this video, and smash that hype button to help this story reach more people.